Well, good evening. We've been gone on fall break, and that's why I haven't recorded the past couple of days, but we've had a good time. Today is Harrison's birthday, and we're going to spend some time with him today to kind of help that be a big day. And you may have heard that we are starting a new, our classes are coming back for this coming Sunday morning and for also for next Wednesday night. Not tonight, but a week from tonight. We'll resume our classes at the building. For those of you who feel comfortable enough to come, we hope that you will, and that you'll invite others, and that I've missed particularly the Wednesday night gathering, and having class time I think will be a good thing. For those of you who are still at home, you are the best judge of when it's time for you to come back, and I don't know when that time will be. Hopefully we'll all know clearly at some point in the future where this virus is no longer a threat. Clearly the virus is still a threat, and if you are sensitive or in a high risk category, you don't need to come. So don't feel guilt if you're not coming. Of course, if you're going everywhere else in the world and just not going to church, we hope that you'll come to church. But that's a side thing, and it's a hard time and nobody can make the decision for you. Just know that we're all praying for you, and hopefully these lessons will help some too. And I'm sure that that'll be posted also on Facebook. In fact, I'll post it with a message tonight. Tonight's message, because we're coming back to class, I'm going to change class a little bit for tonight and resume. We started doing this particular study series of Paul's activities and Acts because I knew that was going to be the summer series for the Gospel Advocates Foundations book. Well, when we come back this coming Sunday morning, we're going to pick up in that book. So we'll kind of probably go over some of the same ground, but that's okay because we haven't had an opportunity to discuss that in person. However, that meant this study needs to change some. I'll still try to post a Wednesday night study online for those of you at home so that there's something for you to kind of sink your teeth into and go on with. It may be, I don't know how to do it yet, but I'm thinking through some things. But our Wednesday night study is going to change starting next week. We're going to be doing something other than Paul in Acts. I'm going to go back through that just for a second and talk about that some because it's a lead into tonight's discussion and into next week's. It's a great transition point. So we've been talking about Paul's work in Acts, and as we've talked about it, this was something I put up at the very beginning of that study. Why exactly are we studying that? And I talked about that in the text. It's the second half of the book of Acts. It's lessons from the ministry of Paul, focused on the growth of the church, the power of the Spirit. That question, though, for in our lives is what we've been spending a long time on. Why have we been unwilling to act on our faith, and what can we do to copy the efforts of the early church? You may not accept that statement, that why have we not been acting on our faith? You may feel like we have been. And I may be talking too personally, but I feel like that I have acted on it to some degree, but not to the degree that I could have, and the church generally has been pretty passive in spreading the gospel, at least lately. We hope people come, we invite people to come, but that's about it. And I think a lot of it is not even raising the question in our own homes. And this is where it gets a little bit, so tonight I'm going to look at that a little bit too and see why did Paul act the way that he acted. And just kind of leave that out there for a second that maybe we can still do more to copy the early church's efforts, particularly in our own small circles. I don't know. Well, I'll come back to that in a second. So let's look at Paul just for a second and where we've been. So where we've been is Paul has been on the second missionary journey. And on the second missionary journey, he went to all those places that are circled there. And then he went right back to them on the third missionary journey. And the second missionary journey started right on the heels of the first missionary journey. It's about 10 years of Paul's life wrapped up into these 3 trips. And he's going through some of the same places. Why is he doing that? We know that when he did, he started with the synagogues, and that's something that I think we can learn from. That he started with people that he knew, a culture that he knew, a language that he spoke, a common backstory. We know that he supported himself in his work, that he worked as a tent maker. In fact, in a second, we're going to turn to 1 Corinthians 9. So if you want to know what passage we're going to go to, that's where you should turn. In that passage, he describes supporting himself so he wouldn't be a burden to the Corinthian church. And how did he do that? By making tents, and you can see him here with Aquila and Priscilla. In that section of Acts that we've already studied, one of the accusations against Paul was that this is the group who's turned the world upside down. The gospel is desperately needed. I don't know how anybody can look at the world and come to the conclusion that we are better off without Christians or with Christian mentality. Our country is suffering tremendously because of that. The world needs the gospel. So this idea that the gospel can change the world is something that Paul was accused of in these chapters. When we started in chapter, all the way back in the early part of Acts, Acts, I don't know, probably 10 or 12 is where we first started, because that's where you kind of first see Paul after his conversion. This is the conversion of Cornelius, and the first missionary journey is pretty shortly after that. Anyway, I say that because in just a few short years, Paul is being accused of, like I said, turning the world upside down. And that's less than 30 years after the death of Jesus. There is an urgency and a fervor that was noticeable and marked in changing things. I think time naturally makes people complacent. And complacency is almost always a bad thing. It's like the negative side of contentment. Contentment is good. Complacency is bad. Complacency means that, if you're an athlete, it means you stop training. If you're a coach, it means you start learning. You stop learning. If you're a teacher, it means you don't change your lesson plans. My daughter got a handout sheet this year, and she told me one of the questions on it, and it was a question that had about a three-wheeler. Do you have a three-wheeler or a car? It's like, a three-wheeler? Let me see that. And she handed me the handout. It had been mimeographed years ago. Three-wheelers have been illegal since the mid-'80s. Well, I don't think that this particular teacher is complacent in all areas, but in the get to know you back to school sheet, he's been pretty complacent, been using the exact same sheet for 35 years. That's impressive. And it's not ideal. And the church runs through that sometimes, from time to time. But it wasn't like that at first. There's an urgency, and that urgency was noticed by others. And Paul is a great reflector of that. And in teaching the gospel, this is one of the other things that I think is hard for us. In Acts 17, this is talking about Athens. It says, many will reject the gospel, but nevertheless some will believe. There will always be a group of people who believe, no matter who rejects it. And I think it's hard for us because that has been I think this has been a rationale for us to be complacent. And I mean, as individually and as congregations, to spend more time talking about infrastructure in church, like buildings and furniture and rooms and things like that. And probably a little too concerned with making sure that we always should be concerned about whether people are happy or not, but that's not the primary obligation of the church. The primary obligation of the church is to teach and to strengthen and encourage one another and to share the gospel. And I think our fear of rejection, not everybody believed in the first century either, and they won't now, but some will believe, and I still believe that. So, where we've been talking recently, Paul was in Corinth for a good chunk of time. In Acts 18, he was in Corinth. Corinth was this great city, this incredible city, this important city, an ancient Roman Empire, a wealthy city, but also a worldly city. And Paul stays there for a year and a half. And notice what I put there on the slide. It says opportunity, and this is one that I've used before, but it says opportunity is unpredictable. This is immediately after the educated people of Athens rejected Paul, and Paul ends up going to Corinth, which is also known as like the Sin City of its day, the Las Vegas of its day. The question that I've got for us is why? Why did Paul stay there? Why did Paul go? And that's why where we're going to tonight. That's why I need you to turn to 1 Corinthians 9. Why does Paul spend a year and a half in Corinth? And part of that you can see in this explanation of this. Paul, at the beginning of the chapter, is defending his right for support and payment. That you don't muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. In the same way, you shouldn't not provide for those who are working in the kingdom. In verse 11, he had said, if we had sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? What does that mean? He means that if we've given you these things that are incredibly valuable, shouldn't you give us something back in return? He said, but at the same time, he has not pushed that right. And this is the verse that I really want you to look at, 1 Corinthians 9. We're also going to read in 2 Corinthians 5. And this is kind of an introduction to what we're going to study in the weeks ahead, and also an explanation as to why Paul did what he did and why we as a church should view the world through the lens that Paul had, where our primary job is evangelism. Verse 12. If others share in this rightful claim on you, do we not even more? Talking about the claim for money. Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right. So in other words, I have the right to ask you to support me, but I haven't made use of that right. Why? But we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. Paul wouldn't do anything that would threaten the gospel, because to Paul, the gospel is, well, let him put it in his own words. In verse 15, but I have not made use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision. In other words, I'm writing to you, but it's not so you'll support me when I come. For I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting, for necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. He says, and he's talking about it all, but at the end of that, in verse 18, he says, what is my reward? Instead of a financial reward, that in preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. Paul believes, and when he says, woe to me, he believes that the gospel is the single most important task on earth, for him as an individual and also for the church. Frankly, we need to return to that mindset. That our primary job is not to secure the political election of people that we agree with. Our primary job is not to secure, financial security for ourselves and our families. Our primary job is not to, frankly, it's not to provide for the needy. It's not to visit the elderly. Those are important jobs that are not to be neglected, and particularly feeding the needy and clothing those who need clothing and providing food for the hungry. Those are a path to sharing the gospel. But the primary job of the church, the main job, reflected all in the book of Acts, is to share the gospel. Now, we can't all be Paul, and I think it's important for me to make sure that you hear me telling you that nobody expects every one of us to be Paul. We do have family obligations that Paul says later in this same book that he's glad that he doesn't have, because that gives him the freedom to focus totally on the needs of the church. And there are people that are like that. There are people that can dedicate their whole lives to the service of the church, and that's a good thing. Many of us have divided attentions. We have things that we have jobs, we have obligations with our family, we have things that we have to do. And that's okay. Nobody's expecting you to pick up and move overseas necessarily. But I think we're all expected to share this mentality. So we, especially to the people that are important to us. See, that's the thing. Years ago when I was in Philippi, and this is true for, you can go around Murray County. There were 50 congregations of the church in Murray County at one time, and now there are, I think, something in the neighborhood of the low 40s. And in 10 years, there's going to be probably in the 30s. What's happening? The smaller country congregations are growing smaller. Cathy's Creek is kind of the rare exception. Cathy's Creek is not a small church. It is, but it is a country church. So what's the difference between Philippi, which was at about 30 members when I left and is even less now, and Cathy's Creek? The primary difference is that family members have converted family members at one and did not at the other. No, I would love to say that I hope that continues to be true at Cathy's Creek, and I certainly pray that it will be. But we're not doing a good job of convincing our own families that the church is important, that faith is important. And partly it's because we don't believe that sharing the gospel is the most important task on earth. So Paul believes that. That's why he can stay in Corinth for a year and a half. Because he knows that the people who need it the most are the worst. The worst people need the gospel the most. So where does that leave us is the question. Well, I just want to close with these few thoughts from the end of the chapter, and then a final thought from 2 Corinthians 5. And Paul says this in verse 19, 1 Corinthians 9, "For though I am free from all, I made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win the Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I might share with them in its blessings." Ultimately, these verses that we read from 1 Corinthians 9 include this one. And it means that we need to be aware that we could be putting obstacles in place for people who want to know the gospel. We should be aware that those obstacles might exist, and those obstacles might be an expectation of dress, or an expectation of behavior, or an expectation that you have your life correct before you come to visit here, or that you believe every point of doctrine exactly like we do before you even worship with us, before you even study with us. Whatever obstacles it is, that could be that we're not open to the worst, that we wouldn't stay a year and a half in the Las Vegas of the ancient world because we're not open to those kind of people. Paul says he became all things to all people, that we need to be flexible and persistent. To become all things to all people means that we aren't married to a traditional approach. And I'm not talking about worship style or anything like that. I'm talking about that our evangelism is limited to announcing to people that we're going to preach the gospel in the church building. That we have to take a more flexible approach. Whatever works is the way Paul talks about it. So sometimes he's in the synagogue, sometimes he's in the open court. In one case, he's down by a riverside and he's talking to his guards. In another case, he's singing in a prison. In another case. But we take advantage of every opportunity. And this persistence continues. That's why I want you to turn real quick to 2 Corinthians 5, because it also shows, and there's just kind of an irony that all this is in Corinth, that both of these letters, written while Paul is on the third missionary journey before he comes back to Corinth, are written to people who he spent a lot of time trying to convince. I want you to look at verse 10, where he says, "For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may receive what is due for him, what is done in the body, whether good or evil." This concept, and this is right after this verse, that we live by faith and not by sight. It is so hard to do that, because what we see is that we don't get much results when we share the gospel. And God says, trust me. And then Paul mentions that all people were going to have to appear before the judgment seat Christ. Everybody. All must appear. That's verse 10, and that's the intro to this verse, verse 11. Therefore, knowing the fear of the Lord, we persuade others. This is one older language version of that. Knowing, therefore, the terror of the Lord, we persuade men. I don't get how some people are not willing to talk to their children about this. We're willing to tell our kids how to teach our kids how to throw a curveball or how to pass on faith in sports teams. I have somehow persuaded Harrison to be a Cowboys fan, and they're terrible, and a Razorback fan, and they have been terrible, even though they won this past weekend. You know, that we pass on these things that don't matter. We've got people that are loyal to truck brands and to rock and roll bands or rock and roll music, different types of music. We've got people that are loyal to restaurants and political parties, and we pass on all kinds of things that we believe are important. We forget. So here's what I'm asking us to do. To remember the fear of the Lord that Paul's describing here. That all will appear before the judgment seat of Christ. So when we continue our study on Sunday morning, we're going to look at the second half of the life of Paul in our class on Sunday morning. And on our Wednesday night class, we're going to continue to look at 2 Corinthians, because 2 Corinthians is a great book. We had a Sunday night series on 1 Corinthians lately, and we never really did. We got close to finishing it, but we never get to 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians is very understudied as a book, generally, because it's in the shadow of 1 Corinthians. So we're going to study that on Wednesday night starting next week. And these passages come from that town, but it's all driven by this desire to remember the fear of the Lord and to act upon it. So when I tell us that we need to remember the fear of the Lord, what I'm really asking us to do is to act. Paul says, we know the terror of the Lord, so we persuade men. Or here, we know the fear of the Lord, so we persuade others. But that knowledge causes us to act. Just a couple of verses down from that. He says, for the love of Christ controls us, because we've concluded this, that one has died for all, therefore all have died, and he died for all. But those who live might not live longer, no longer live for themselves, but for him who for their sake died and was raised. This idea that he died for all, and all have died, with this transformative power, this transformative power, is the love of Christ, and it should compel us. The end result being, a few verses later, that anyone who is in Christ is a new creation. The old is gone, and the new has come. My life is completely different because I'm a Christian. And I think the same thing would be true for my children, and for your children, and for all the children of the church at Kathy's Creek. And so if we share with our kids things that don't matter, like Hank Williams once saying, Hank Williams Jr., how to skin a buck and run a trot line, or tie a fishing lure on, or all these other things, how to drive a car, but we don't teach them what's most important, then we're missing out. And the same thing's true for our friends and our neighbors. So when we have people over. And I think if we all just converted just the people in our household, if we convinced them, persuaded them that the gospel was life-changing, I think we'd receive a revival in this area, in this community. And who knows where it would stop. Because as I've noted many times, once you start unraveling how people are related in Murray County, it's not long before you realize we're all related in Murray County. You just start tracking the family lines back far enough, and it touches everybody just about. So let's just get to family and see where it takes us. All right. The main thing is we need to just change our mindset to believe that evangelism is our primary task. And if that mindset is changed, then our actions will follow. So that's what I'm praying for this week. Continue also to pray for those we know that have been sick or wounded. Continue to pray for Justin as he works in the National Guard and is at basic training and stressful, difficult time. Pray for our college students as they're going through weird stuff and may get sent home early, depending on where they're going to school. I know that's something Harding's considering. Their classes are not the same. College is supposed to be stressful and different anyway, but the corona has upped that. Pray for our nation as we go through the debates and the election. And definitely continue to pray for Gail and David Kincaid and their family. Thank you for all you do. I hope to see you all soon. Have a great night.